So we added NGRX, and therefore now it's of course time to make sure that we also have some data in that store. Some data that can be used in our components. For example, here in the counter output component, I want to read data from that store. I want to get the current counter value from that store so that I can then output it on the screen with help of this component here. Now, to get data into the store, we need a reducer, because ultimately in this NGRX architecture here, reducers are the things that change the data in the store. So if we just want to set up some initial data for now, we still need a reducer, because it's that reducer that sets up the initial value and then potentially changes it over time. So to get some data into our store, or to also change that data later, we need a reducer. And that's therefore what we're going to start with now. For that, in this application, here in my app folder, I'll add a new folder which I'll name store or counter store. This name is up to you, but this will be the folder where I want to store some NGRX specific files. For example, the file that will define my reducers, and I will store those files in a folder called store, because NGRX is all about having that global data store. Now, even though it's just one store, you could have different reducer files for different parts of your application, but you will see this later. For the moment, it's this one store folder in this app folder, which I'm creating here. And in that folder, I'll now add a counter.reducer.ts file. And my goal now is to add the reducer that is responsible for managing the data that belongs to this counter part of this app in this file here. For that, in the counter.reducer.ts file, I'll start by creating a new constant, a new variable in the end that will never change though, hence I'll make it a constant, which I will name counter reducer. Now, the name is up to you, but this name here makes a lot of sense, because in the end, it will be a reducer that is responsible for managing my counter data. And such a reducer can now be created with help of createReducer. And that is a function that can be imported from @ngrx/store. So that's a function provided by this third-party library that will create such a reducer thing. Now, under the hood, a reducer in the end is just a function that takes some data as input and spits out the updated state, the updated counter state in this case here. So the updated data that should be stored in that store. That's what a reducer is under the hood, but we'll take a closer look under the hood of a reducer in the next lecture, actually. So here we'll just create it with help of createReducer, and then this createReducer function needs at least one argument. And that one argument, which it needs at least, is the initial state of that piece of the global store. And for that, I'll add another constant here, which I'll name initial state, though this name also is up to you. It doesn't have to be initial state, but here I'll name it initial state. And then here for my counter, that initial state simply is the number 0. But, and that's now really important, when using NGRX, anything can be your state. It can be a number, as it's the case here. It could also be some text. It could be a Boolean value. It could be an object with the counter value nested inside of it, for example. And it could also be an array, of course. So whichever kind of data you need to manage. In this case, for this basic example here, the counter is a number, and therefore I'll just store that number in here. But later in the section, you'll also see more complex state examples. So here it's now this initial state value which I passed to createReducer, and therefore of course I could have also just passed 0 in here, but it is a practice you will see quite a bit, that you define that initial state in a separate variable or constant, simply to make it a bit easier to quickly see what your initial state is if we take a look at this file. Of course, at the moment, this file is pretty empty, but the more complex your state and your reducer gets, the more logic might be added here, and being able to then quickly see the initial state can therefore be useful. And with that, we now already actually got everything we need to set up this reducer. It's not too useful yet because it doesn't contain any logic for changing that state, but it has an initial state, and therefore we can now connect this reducer to this store that's set up in the app module here in this module-based app to make that data available in this application. And of course, I'll also show you how to do this in a standalone component app in a second. The reducer code is always the same though. So here we should then export this reducer to make it available outside of this file. And now when using ng modules, what you have to do is here in this ng module based app, in this place where the store is in the end created with help of store module for root, you should pass an object to for root. And then in that object, you can pick any key of your choice, for example, counter, to describe the kind of data piece you want to add to that store. And then as a value for that key, you use your reducer. In my case here, this counter reducer, which of course therefore also must be imported. And then it's used as a value for this key. And if you had multiple reducers for different parts of your application and different features of your application, you could simply add them here as key value pairs. If we had an auth reducer that manages the current authentication status of a user, you could store it under an auth key in this object. Now we don't have that here, but that is how you could build one store consisting of multiple reducers that manage different pieces of the overall application data. Now here it's just a counter reducer, but that of course is an important first step. And it's basically the same when using standalone components. There in main.ts, where provide store was added, you now can pass an object to provide store. Then choose any key of your choice, for example, again counter, and then assign your reducer as a value for that key. So here I haven't added my store folder yet, so I'll copy that store folder from the module-based app here into the app folder of the standalone component-based app so that I have my counter reducer there as well. And now in main.ts, I can assign this counter reducer, which of course must be imported, as a value to counter here. And with that, we added to this global store. And again, just as explained before, for the module-based app, if you now had multiple reducers for different parts of the app, you could of course all add them here to this provide store function. But of course here I only have that one reducer. And that's how you set up a reducer and how you then register it, both for an app that uses standalone components and an app that uses modules. Now, as you saw in the previous lecture, creating a reducer is quite simple. You just have to execute the create reducer function, which is provided by ngrx store. Now, it can be interesting to take a look under the hood here, also because later in this section, I will be using a slightly different way of creating these reducers, also to help you understand what's going on under the hood, and also because this create reducer function has been around for quite some time now, but is not supported in older versions of NGRX. And if you're therefore working on projects that do use older versions of NGRX, because they might be using older versions of Angular, which is not uncommon, you should know the alternative way of creating such reducers, which in the end is used under the hood by create reducer and which will always work no matter which NGRX version you're using. And when using this older or simply alternative approach here, you would create the reducer function yourself. Counter reducer could still be the name, and you would still export it like this. Now this counter reducer function, which we're creating here, should always accept at least one value. And that one argument that should be accepted at least should be the current state that's being managed by NGRX. Because counter reducer, this reducer function here, will later be executed by NGRX. And NGRX will, for example, execute this reducer function whenever an action occurs, or also when it initially sets up the store. And that's, by the way, exactly the same for the reducer that was created with create reducer. This reducer, which also is simply such a function under the hood, will be executed by NGRX when an action occurs or when the store is being set up. Now, when this function is then executed by NGRX, it expects that you then return the updated new state. And therefore here, for this very basic use case, we might want to return the initial state here. So we could set up our reducer like this, though it's actually recommended that you instead set your initial state as a default value for this argument, so that if this reducer function should be executed without a state being passed into it, which is exactly what will be the case when the store is created for the first time, because at that point of time, no state values will exist yet. So when that's the case, the initial state will be passed in as an argument by NGRX instead, and you can then simply return the current state as a default value in this function. So with that, counter reducer here will always return the current state, and initially, when it's being executed the first time and there is no state yet, the state will simply be set to this initial state here. So you could also create your reducer like this, and that's in the end what's happening here when using create reducer. And of course, for this very simple reducer, which doesn't contain any extra logic yet, both approaches look quite similar. You will see more differences a little bit later once we start adding some logic to the reducer. But for the moment, that's it. And you can, of course, therefore use exactly the same approach in this application that uses standalone components. You could also create your reducer like this, and it would then still be mapped to that key of your choice in the place where the store is being created. So therefore also here in this ng module to register this reducer. And then, as mentioned, this reducer function will be executed by NGRX when it first creates that store. But that's of course not the only point of time where this reducer will be executed.